Hi everyone, I hope that you are all doing well. I'm looking forward to checking in with you to do a quick recap of our Module 3 last week and to introduce the module that we'll be working on actually for the next 2 weeks. So to go ahead and clarify, we'll be working on the Gifted Education Programming Model, which is Module 4, this coming week and also the week after that. So a little bit different, but I wanted to give you guys some time to really dig into this content. So real quick, let's talk about last week's discussion post. So we have a case, which is totally real world, that we have a most likely pretty affluent family who is able to send their student to a private school for the gifted, having a very personalized learning environment that would most likely be pretty beneficial to most, if not all, students identified for gifted and talented services. This is honestly the case that I struggle with the most because when we ask ourselves the question, do all gifted students have the right to gifted education? Immediately, at least immediately, I say yes. Clearly, obviously, we want all of our students to have the best education possible. But as several of you guys noted, and as we started digging into this content this week, you'll see that although we're definitely passionate, especially as advocates for gifted learners, and want them to have all of these services, when we come to the question of whether or not this is a right, it gets a little bit messy. So the crux of gifted education is that it's a state-by-state decision. So even district to district, honestly, at times school to school, gifted education services are really going to differ. This is both at times a good thing. I always like to find the bright side. But as several of you guys noted, it's also a challenge. The biggest challenge, in my opinion, is on the social emotional impact of the students in terms of gifted programming. So, for example, I could be identified as gifted in South Carolina, but then if my family moves to Nebraska, I could no longer be identified for gifted and educated or gifted and talented education services. That is definitely going to have some sort of social emotional impact on me as a child. Furthermore, when we have the districts really making a lot of these decisions, we have to be aware of the fact that not all districts are the same. So there are some districts that are located in very affluent communities that may or may not have more resources and therefore may or may not have more gifted education programming opportunities, which creates a lot more disparity. So I just wanted, before I went through and looked at some of the individual responses that I wanted to call out, I really wanted to emphasize the good and the bad of the districts making these decisions. In some cases, it's a good thing because, as we know, education is not one size fits all. So what works for the students in Florida may not work for a district that's also in Florida, but that's in a very different cultural setting. So I do see some positive when we consider the districts or the states really making these decisions. But also on the flip side, we see the negative because there's bound to be a lot of disparity in that. And also because when students move from one state or even district to another, they're likely to receive different services. So in order to call out a few of you, I'm just going to go down my list here like usual. I wanted to quote Tiffany, who actually quoted Ellen Winter, but I do really appreciate her calling this out. This quote says, "Keeping a child who can do sixth grade work in a second grade classroom is not saving childhood, but rather robbing the student's desire to learn." So as you see, especially this week when we're going to start digging deep into acceleration and enrichment, oftentimes we are telling ourselves, okay, we're just helping the student's social emotional needs, so we're going to keep them in second grade, even though they can learn at a sixth grade level. It's easy to say to ourselves, this is just because we want them to socially develop, but actually we're really robbing them of that desire to learn. So I appreciated Tiffany pointing that out. Thomas did a good job of picking apart that Broadley versus Board case, and also mentioning the pretty big theme in that case was that the student, Neil, was bored all the time. So gifted children are often bored in the classroom, and that leads to all different types of behavioral problems. That leads to underachievement, and then because of that, they're not appropriately identified for the gifted services that they need in the first place. I also wanted to point out Tanner's idea to ask if the student is learning, not if he or she is scoring well on a test. So that's really important as the educator when we consider, am I doing a good job as the teacher? Am I doing well, right? What's our first inclination? At least for me, oftentimes I'm like, well, let's look at my grade book. How many A's do I have? How many B's do I have? But really, that should not be our measure of success. We want to be asking ourselves, are our students actually learning? Are they actually improving? That goes back to this concept of validity that we discussed previously. We may not be measuring how much we're teaching them. We could just be measuring how much they already knew. Leslie did a really excellent job quoting some research that supports the effectiveness of gifted education. So in the context when we are advocating for these students, it's not enough for us just to come in and say that we're really passionate about gifted learners. That works in this environment, but it doesn't work when we're trying to convince administrators and other high up people that we need gifted education programming. What you really need to do in that case is be able to hit them with some facts, and quoting that research like Leslie did is an excellent way to do that. I also liked how Jill started to parse apart how gifted education services would be providing an appropriate social support for these students. And she made an excellent point that serving the gifted and talented is not easier than teaching a regular education classroom. When we assume that gifted and talented students are the easy students, that typically means that we have a very stereotypical view of what a gifted child is, and because of that, we're probably having issues with identification for the services. Melanie had a good analysis of, again, that state-by-state interpretation of the necessity of gifted education. Unfortunately, there is not a clear federal law that says, yes, all gifted students are required to have appropriate services. This really is a state-by-state issue. And as the readings mentioned, it's even a district-by-district issue. Because of that, your job is so important, because as advocates for gifted learners, we are really able to work our way up and raise awareness and hopefully encourage the district and encourage the state to start allocating the funds for gifted education services. Also, I wanted to mention Sarah did a good job parsing out as well those different state-by-state requirements. But I also appreciated how she mentioned that one of the biggest obstacles for gifted students is often school itself. So they may not fit into the game of school, which is an unfortunate truth. When we start looking at gifted education programming this coming week, you'll see different specialized schools. For example, we have what's called the Autonomous Learner Model, or ALM. That's a very specialized type of school for some students who may not be doing very well in a traditional school setting. Sometimes they're, quote, too gifted for their own good. So a autonomous learner model is a really good strategy for those types of students, because they become owners of their own learning, and they start to actually build their own curriculum. But that little tangent is a great illustration, right? So are all students going to have access to that autonomous learning model? No. I mean, that's the sad truth, is that we can't provide every service to every student, and this is where it gets really messy. And the reason why I think this module is so important is it is hopefully convincing you that you really need to have a voice when it comes to gifted education, that even as just the quote, just the teacher, you can really work your way up in helping others understand how important it is to meet these unique needs of these students. As Norma said, education is only equal if all students are learning, so that's a great place to start. One last note from you all, I liked how Jerry mentioned to both expect and to monitor the growth of all students within a gifted education program. That word expect is really wonderful. That goes back to the deficit versus dynamic mindset that we discussed. So when we have a dynamic mindset, we consider and expect that our students will learn. But monitoring is also important because we want to make sure that our gifted programming is actually working and is actually benefiting the students. So just to recap what, again, I think to be the hard truth of gifted education, really this is a state-by-state, at times district-by-district decision. I can't remember which article it was, so I don't want to misquote, but there was one article that had a good analysis of what do we do with this and pointed out first, we really want to push for funding, and we want to push our state to mandate gifted education services. That mandate is essential. Furthermore, we want to make sure we have quality services. So as we've mentioned previously, we don't want to have identification that doesn't match the services. We want to make sure we're monitoring the programs and that they're actually working. And lastly, we really want to provide the research that supports the gifted education programming. Unfortunately, with No Child Left Behind, we do have a definite emphasis on closing gaps. And while that is important, unfortunately, when we focus on closing gaps, we often lose all of our focus for the students who are really high up there. They often get left behind. So we're going to transition this next 2 weeks to different approaches to gifted education programming. Again, I just want to point out, guys, that you have the ability to be really true advocates for these students. And as you start to investigate these different types of models for gifted education programming, you'll probably see that some of them surprise you. Again, we've talked about this already, but acceleration is proven to be very effective. However, culturally, we have kind of a mistrust of acceleration because we are tempted to think that it won't be a good idea in terms of the social and emotional development. So, all right, now that our distraction is gone, I want to talk briefly about this coming week. So again, this week we have the beginning of a 2-week module on gifted education programming. So this week you're going to read a case study that is basically covering what one district's gifted education program looks like. The scenario in this case is that the gifted education coordinator has been asked to give a presentation to the district about what the gifted education program is. So in the content in the library, you'll read through all different types of programming, whether it's acceleration or whether it's enrichment, whether it's what we call levels of services. And you'll investigate all of those, and then from there start to see the strengths and the weaknesses of all of these different approaches. The challenge in the case study is to emphasize, or rather analyze, how this gifted education program is looking based on the research. So what are some things that this gifted education program is doing well? And that's going to lead us into an activity we'll do next week when we start to think of ways to improve this gifted program. So for the discussion board, as always, your first post will be due Friday evening, and then you'll have those reactions to your classmates due the following Sunday evening. So nothing's different. Friday for initial and Sunday for your reactions to those posts. So I'm looking forward to seeing what you think about this gifted education program that is explained in the case study and using some of the content in the library to support your answer. From that, your other assignment for this week is, if I can act nerdy in this case, I think it's kind of a fun one because you get to analyze a gifted education program that you have some experience with. So what I want you to do is choose a gifted education program that you know best, whether it's the gifted services at your school where you work, the gifted services in your child's school, the gifted services that you as a student way back when, if you were potentially identified for these services, that you experienced, any of these things. So it's entirely up to you. I want you to use a gifted education program that you feel that you know pretty well. Now, in order to do this assignment, you'll need to remember a pretty decent amount of information, and or you'll need to do some outside research. Nothing crazy, but more like, can you Google the school's webpage, and is there a tab on gifted education, and what does it say about that? Now, this is a very real-world assignment, so what you're doing is, based on this week's content, you're analyzing this gifted education program to see if it is supported by the literature. So this is all on Blackboard, but you're going to walk through 5 main questions. So the first question asks you, how does this gifted education program define giftedness in the first place? Okay, so how do they define giftedness in the first place? Then what are some of the methods for identification to be given these services? And then to analyze the services that are provided. So if this is an acceleration program or an enrichment program, maybe it's a little bit of both. And then lastly, to analyze the areas for improvement and to analyze the strengths. So the key to this assignment is not that you have all of this information. I just want to see you analyzing. So it may be, hey, I looked all over this website. I can't even find a tab for gifted education. So I don't really know how they identify for this gifted program. Well, that's fine. That's the truth. I just want to know what you feel about that. What does that say about the gifted program? So don't be concerned if you can't answer all 5 questions. You just need to address all 5 of those components. So that assignment will be due on Sunday. So just to recap, you have your initial discussion post due Friday, your responses to that due Sunday, and also that analysis of a gifted program due Sunday evening as well. So next week, we will actually continue on with some more investigation of gifted education programming. Next week, we'll work in small groups and work to improve the gifted education program that we will study in this week's case study. As always, I'm here if you have any questions, and apparently it turned into nighttime as I was recording this, so I'm sorry if it's difficult to see, but I hope that you guys are all doing well, and I look forward to reading more of your work. Thanks.